All right, welcome. Today we're going to look at how important was the French and Indian War as a cause of the American Revolution. And I'm going to argue it's pretty important. And so let's go through this without trying to get too much detail of the war, but still understanding the main ideas. And so England, France, and Spain were preparing for a fight for control of North America. And that before the major French and Indian War, these are kind of the major territories. After the war, significant differences. France is pretty much kicked out. And these are European fights, but the people living, the colonial French, the colonial Spanish, the colonial Brits, were all fighting, as well as the Native Americans already living there. All these different sides are all fighting for this land. And so from 1688 to 1763, 4 world wars are shaking Europe and the colonies as well. And I do mean world wars because we're taking place in Asia, Africa, South America, North America, and Europe. These fights are having worldwide impacts. These fights include King William's War, Queen Anne's War, King George's War, and of course the final French and Indian War. Americans are going to be a part of each and every one of these wars, and because it's got to have a little bit of blowback, a little bit of an aftershock from Europe. And ultimately, these will set up the stage for America's final independence. So let's look at the cause of this war. In 1754, England hoped to expand their territory, especially on the Pennsylvania and the Virginia border. They wanted to keep expanding west, but so did France. And so they decided, okay, let's send forward a couple troops to stake a claim and kind of negotiate with the tribes there, say, hey, we want to expand here. And they also set up forts just in case the French also wanted to expand there. France wanted this valley because they wanted to expand and really connect their Canadian claims down to their lower Mississippi Valley. And that they had claims in Canada, they had claims in Louisiana, and they wanted to connect the two by taking over the Mississippi River and the Ohio River as well. And so they sent in a few different troops. These troops included Colonel George Washington, who attacked French positions, but the Americans weren't that successful at actually taking over the French positions. And so they were able to start this fight, but they really couldn't finish it on their own. And eventually British troops do arrive to start to help out. We'll see how they do. And in a few cases, they are successful early on, and they have some serious failures. 1755, British troops are able to attack Nova Scotia and kick out, as well as British troops in Nova Scotia attack Acadia, and they kick out the French presence there, and so the Acadians move to Louisiana and they become Cajun. Course of the war. So how does the war actually go? So for the first 2 years, these are just undeclared. It's an undeclared war as these colonials are fighting off in Ohio, where the actual Europeans don't officially declare war yet, and these fights just keep expanding out and out and out until it's a world war and it's time for war. And so these eventual war, it'll be quite world war, and that's fighting in Europe, fighting in the Caribbean, fighting in India, fighting in the Philippines, fighting in South America, Africa, on all oceans. It is everywhere. As far as the sides of this war, Britain, Portugal, and Prussia, or Germany, is on one side. France, Spain, Austria, and Russia on the other side. And most of the actual big nasty fighting when it comes to this is really a European war, and it involves all the European colonies across the planet, so most of the fighting is actually in Europe. And the French spend a lot of time fighting the Germans, and they waste so many troops fighting the Germans over here that they don't have the forces, they don't have the time to go off and defend their American colonies or their Indian colonies, or really their colonies anywhere else. They spend so much time trying to gain German territory or even defend their own French territory that really they're going to lose mostly their worldwide empire. And so this is kind of a look at where all the major fighting is happening. So all the areas that are colored in, those are the empires that are involved. And anytime you have these little crosshatches, we are seeing where the fights are happening. And so there are 2 names for this war. For the Americans, we call this the French and Indian War because that's who we were fighting. And we tended to name our wars either after the king who was in charge or who we were fighting against. We already had a King George's War, so we're going to name it the French and Indian War, even though we had Indians fighting on our team too. So it's not a great name for a war, but it's what we got. And so major fighting in the French and Indian War sector, but over here you've got the European sector, lots of fighting there, lots of nasty little fights in India, and some minor fights here and there. But the major fights are really in three major different locations. And so as the war progresses, the English say, hey, Americans, how about you have a meeting and get your act together? And so they call for the Albany Congress, and so they call for everybody to kind of meet together. Ben Franklin, one of our kind of main scientists, philosophers, thinkers, and politicians, he creates the Join or Die cartoon in the Pennsylvania Gazette in 1754 as its central message to the Americans saying, hey, we need to get together or they're going to chop us up into bits. And so if we are united, they can't take us down. You need to join or you will die. And this will be used later on in the American Revolution. Gifts are given to the Iroquois, and that they were really the strongest confederacy of tribes. We were hoping to keep them as allies, really to win and beat the French. We needed Native American allies here. But we really embarrassed ourselves, and we were not a united states at all. Only 7 out of 13 colonies even showed up to the meeting. And the plan was, our proposal was, why don't we create one American government? And the British don't like that idea. The British reject that. But so do most Americans. Most Americans didn't like that idea. They just weren't as forward-thinking as guys like Ben Franklin. And then we started to fight each other in front of the tribe, really making us look even worse. We are not a united front. And so the Iroquois break off relations with the British, and they threatened to start to trade with France. So we just lost one of our biggest native allies. We showed that we are not a United States. And even the British are starting to lose faith in that the Americans can pull us off. Once the British send troops over here, there is a bit of friction between the Americans and these British officers, and they are meant to kind of come over in here and help us, and we don't like it much for a couple reasons. And so here's some of the reasons as far as why we fight. And one of the biggest reasons is the officers are in charge of the militias, and we don't quite like that. And that we are used to being in charge of our own local military, and that we would basically all the farmers would show up and they'd train in a field on how to be a good militia. And if they liked Bob, Bob gets to be the officer. And the British don't like that, saying, no, I have actual training. I'm a bit better and more experienced than Bob the officer. And so when the Americans say, hey, we have this whole system as far as how our military works, the British say, no, we're a real military. Hey, we're not going to accept what you have. And so even George Washington is demoted from his American rank as colonel because the Brits just don't recognize our American rank because it was a bit messy. Next little thing that really annoyed them was economically we were horrible to the British in that the colonial smugglers continued to trade with the enemy. The Americans kept trading with the enemy to make money when the British Navy was trying to starve them out. And we just kept selling them food because we wanted to make money. And so eventually England banned all shipments coming from the northern colonies to stop this illegal trade, to really help the war going. And they started to search to make sure that we were not trading with the enemy. And so they created the writs of assistance, which is kind of like a warrant, which allowed searches of ships, businesses, homes to stop the smuggling to the enemy. And this really helped the British realize how bad smuggling was, how widespread we were at cheating on our taxes. The southern colonies, again, we are not united. The southern colonies are really far from most of the fighting, and they refused to provide troops or even money. They didn't want to pay for it. They didn't see it as their problem. Eventually, they did help after England offered to reimburse them. But for the first part of the war, they just figured it's not my problem. That's a northern issue. First couple of years of the war, England failed miserably. General Braddock was a mess. French and Indian forces attacked from the forest. They slaughtered British General Braddock and his troops. And really, they're using guerrilla warfare against a traditional European-style army. And we start to realize, hey, this might be a good tactic when we get to our actual American Revolution too. But this idea that the British Army is so great and invincible really is shattered by this pretty nasty defeat. And after this defeat, the Americans are kind of left to defend themselves on the frontier, so we really have to start to get our act together. After this major fight's happening, finally war is actually declared in 1756. And we get more attacks on French points and French forts, and we continue to fail. Until we get somebody who knows what they're doing, and that's William Pitt. He becomes the new foreign minister and says, okay, we're going to look at this big picture. We keep throwing troops at them, but we need to concentrate our efforts because we're trying to fight in so many different locations across the planet. We're going to lose them all. So why don't we put all our efforts into winning America? We'll probably lose in Europe. We'll probably lose in the Caribbean. But if we get America, that's a huge chunk of land for us. And so he's able to organize this major fight. He takes troops away from other locations, pushes them into the colonies, and he's quite successful in this. He is able to capture Quebec. And so really if you follow the little map here, they've already taken Nova Scotia. They're going through, they take Quebec. After they take Quebec, boom, 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 they're able to kind of go through this string of victories and pretty much take down all the major French Canadian cities. And once they got that, Canada has lost, France has lost, and England now has America. And so here is the treaty that they sign at the end. England wins big, France loses big. France loses all of Canada and pretty much all of North America. All lands that they claimed east of the Mississippi, this land is now part of England. They get to keep Haiti and a couple of their small islands, but that's okay because those were really big money makers for them. We'll talk about later. They had a couple small colonies in India. They lose those. Spain gets a huge chunk of land. They get pretty much the central part of the United States today, Louisiana. They get all lands west of the Mississippi, so they get a huge chunk of land. They just very much doubled their size. But they do lose Florida to England. England gets all this pink territory, so they get Canada. They also get exclusive rights to the Caribbean slave trade. They get trade with India, which is going to be really big for them later. And they also get Florida, I guess. And so it's a huge change in the map as a result of this war because Pitt was able to take this gamble and say, let's concentrate on America. He won big. And all this territory, the French territory, they're gone. They get to keep Saint-Domingue, which is another word for Haiti, as we'll see later. And England gets this huge expansion of their territory. So most of that negotiation did not include the actual Native American tribes. So when the war is over, a lot of them just go home, but not all of them. And that there is a serious threat still to these tribes. And so with the Spanish and the French threat no longer there, it's just the British and the natives couldn't play the Europeans against each other. Now it's just them and the English. And so they realized, okay, we need to make a stand because we can't play them off each other anymore. All future deals are just with the English and the English alone. Plus, they just lost a whole bunch of troops from this fight. And so this is kind of a final stand for them. 1763, after the war has been negotiated amongst the Europeans, Chief Pontiac of the Ottawa says, okay, we got to make a fight now, or this is the end of us. And so he is able to attack and take down multiple forts along the frontier. All that land that England now has, he wants to make sure England doesn't keep it. He wants to make sure that's going to stay in native hands. So he's able to attack successfully most of these forts and kill 2,000 soldiers and settlers in a very short amount of time. All but 3 forts are taken down. But then, smallpox. Biological warfare is used by the English. They provide smallpox blankets to the tribe during a harsh winter as a sign of goodwill, saying, hey, it's a harsh winter, I know we're enemies, but we're going to work together. So here, have some smallpox blankets that we got off the hospital. They don't say that they're smallpox blankets, but it's pretty much just wipes out the native forces. Pontiac is later killed, and this rebellion fails. But it does confirm for the British that Americans couldn't handle taking care of themselves, that England needed to send forward troops to make sure that they could hold on to their colonies. And so they decide we're going to keep 10,000 troops on the border in case of further native attacks because the Americans aren't taking care of themselves. Plus, if the Americans are getting all the benefits of these troops, the Americans should pay for these troops too. And so it's proposed that there will be taxes raised to pay for their defense. And for the last 200 years, the Americans have not had to pay for the military. But this will be the first time now the Americans have to pay for their military. Plus, to kind of keep any further attacks at bay, the king declares a proclamation of 1763. Anything past the Appalachian Mountains is a no-go zone. Hey, Americans are not allowed to settle past these mountains until things calm down. They want to figure out what to do with local Native American tribes before Americans start rushing in and causing another war or causing another Pontiac to rise up. Americans ignore this, say, hey, the whole reason we fought this war was to get that land. And so, yeah, you betcha I'm going to move. And so 30,000 settlers ignore this rule and they move west anyways. And so what's the overall effect on England? Overall, they get to double the size of their empire, but they also double the size of their debt. And so it's just more money, more problems for them. The national debt doubles. The cost of running the American colonies increases vastly. 70,000 before this war happens, 350,000 after this war. So it's just so much more expensive to run this country now. And they said, okay, it's time to reorganize this thing. America's gotten pretty big. We need to figure out how to run America more efficiently. Plus, they just got Canada, and that included all the people that lived in Canada already. So 80,000 French Canadians, they now need a new government. And so they have to figure out, okay, how are we going to run their government? Because we don't want those Canadians rising up and trying to form their own country. Plus, they need a new Western policy, as they want to make sure that the English, or these Americans, will be able to settle in that land that they just got. They want to keep the fur trade going with the tribes, because that's big money. But they also want to make sure that they're not going to get another major rebellion from Native Americans. So they have to figure out some type of negotiation between these parties. And they also need to take care of the smuggling. American smuggling was out of control during the war. It's only gotten worse. And so they really have to figure out what to do with these Americans always cheating on their taxes. And so was it inevitable? We're going to have a revolution no matter what. And here's where historians disagree. And sometimes it's the same facts that we are fighting over. And so I may repeat a few things because both sides are right. The facts are indisputable. How we interpret those facts is up for debate. And so as far as, yes, we were probably going to rebel anyways. One, well, we had a strong economy. We were doing so well that we started to think maybe we don't need England anymore. Maybe we can be independent on our own because economically we're doing fine. Plus, we got used to being without a king. And then we had all these colonial governments. And these colonial governments, we took care of ourselves. We didn't really see the need for the king or a parliament anymore. We had been independent for so long. We got to make our own rules. And all of a sudden the king wants to come back. We just weren't used to it. A lot of the British governors that were sent over to rule over the colonial legislatures, they started to complain that these Americans started to have a spirit of independence and started to really want to do everything by themselves. And this war, although we weren't too successful in uniting, it did start to unite us and encouraged us to work together a bit more. And soldiers from different colonies started to meet each other, work with each other. And so it's a starting point. We were not quite united, but we did start to be. Now that France is gone, we didn't really need English troops anymore. We didn't need the British Navy, the British Army anymore, because we didn't have any threats around us anymore. And so we were really claiming this red territory, but all the pink territory was now open. There was no longer a French threat, so all we had were native threats, and we just didn't think that was big enough to worry about. And so we just didn't see the point. Plus, we now have the experience of we were able to create 20,000 American troops in this war, and we could probably create 20,000 more American troops if the need arose again. So we just didn't feel the need that we needed to have redcoats here anymore. Here's the downside. Here again, same fact, different interpretation. Most historians agree, we were not united, and that there were vast distances. America's really big, much bigger than Europe. And so there's vast distances between the colonies, along with geographic barriers. We're split up by mountains and rivers. And so South Carolina just didn't talk to Massachusetts that often. We also had major conflicting religions, as Catholics and Quakers and Anglicans and Congregationalists. We had serious disagreements on the nature of Christianity, and so there was another reason why we just weren't united. We had these different opinions on religion. We still We had conflicting ethnicities. We were slowly turning American, but this whole idea as far as, hey, were we American yet? There was still some fighting, and there was still some ethnic pride between the Irish, the Scots-Irish, the Germans, the English, the Dutch, etc. So we weren't 100% American, we were just starting to become American. We had slightly different types of governments between Pennsylvania and Virginia, those different types of colonies, and so it just wasn't 100% the same. This is a nice map showing the boundary disputes, and that there were serious boundary disputes, and that we really couldn't figure out where the borders ended for each little state. They were claiming large parts of territory, and this fight continued for decades, and so we're still seeing these fights between each other. And there's also these class differences, in that the farmers were still hating the wealthy city tradesmen, and so there's all these sorts of fights when it comes to class, religion, ethnicity, and the borders. Another reason why, as far as it was unlikely to have an American Revolution, in that we were pretty good with England. We were pretty strong with England at that point. England gave us the freedom to run our own show, to run our own governments, and we were happy to have it. Most colonists were pretty proud to be British, and remaining with the empire made economic sense. We were guaranteed trade deals with England. Our economy has been booming ever since, and so we've had a great economy so far. And we had to pay very few taxes. We paid lower taxes than the English did, and had, in most cases, a higher standard of living than they did. So we were doing just fine. In 1763, really nobody thought or even wanted to be independent. It was just too outlandish. We were starting to feel different, we were starting to feel American, but the idea of independence was just a step too far at this point. And so there we are, the French and Indian War, and how much of an impact it had in that change for us.